I stared straight at my father, across the kitchen table, in our ancestral home in Beacon Hill, and delivered the ultimatum I had been calculating for months. If I hear one more syllable from your wife regarding my finances, Gary, the period of professional courtesy is over. I will personally inform her of her exact standing and why my capital remains outside her jurisdiction. Do you understand? The kitchen went dead. Only the low hum of the refrigerator filled the void. Angela's hand, clutching her overpriced porcelain, stayed suspended in midair. My father looked at me as if his only daughter had just become a stranger. This was not a family dinner anymore. It was an opening statement. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. The drive back from Beacon Hill to my studio apartment was the quietest 20 minutes of my life. I did not turn on the radio. I did not need the noise. My mind was already a high-speed processor, running numbers, scanning ledgers, and identifying every vulnerability in my financial perimeter. By the time I turned the key in my lock, the transition from daughter to forensic auditor was complete. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. It was a series of ledger entries waiting to be balanced. I did not cry. I did not ask why. I simply set my laptop on the desk and watched the screen flicker to life at 12:12 a.m. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I had provided the liquidity that kept the facade of their Beacon Hill lifestyle from crumbling, while they treated my contributions as a standard line item on their budget. Now, the audit was beginning. My father had a power of attorney on my secondary accounts. From when I was younger, it was a legacy of trust that I had never bothered to revoke because I believed blood was a binding contract. I was wrong. Love had been a subscription service, and I was done footing the bill. With 3 precise clicks, I initiated the legal revocation of his access. I watched the status bar move across the screen, a digital guillotine dropping on his ability to touch my future. $180,000. That was the total in my primary savings money earned through 80-hour work weeks, missed holidays, and the kind of professional discipline Gary and Angela could not comprehend. I opened the portal for a new, high-yield private trust. This was not just a bank account. It was a digital fortress with multi-factor authentication that required my biometric signature and a verbal passcode they would never guess. I entered the transfer amount, $180,000. The cursor blinked, a small, rhythmic heartbeat on the screen. I thought about all the times Angela had casually mentioned how much the property taxes were increasing. I thought about Gary's heavy sighs when his firm's revenue dipped, always waiting for me to volunteer a temporary loan that was never repaid. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrawn for too long. I hit enter. The silence in my apartment feels earned, a stark contrast to the performative peace I have spent over a decade maintaining. I closed my eyes and let the hum of the city replace the sound of Gary's heavy, guilt-tripping sighs. People often ask why I stayed so long, why I let them treat my bank account like a communal well for 4 years. They do not understand that for some of us, our family home is not a sanctuary, it is a prison without bars. It is a series of invisible shackles, forged in the fires of survival. My mother died when I was 15 years old. Cancer is an efficient auditor. It stripped her life away in a single winter, leaving a vacuum in our Beacon Hill home that Gary could not handle. Within 6 months, the vacancy was filled. Angela arrived, with her polished nails and a soft, dangerous voice. I was 15, grieving, and suddenly expected to be the adult in the room. Gary did not protect me. He drafted me into a new contract I never signed. Strong, that was the word everyone used for me at the funeral, but being strong was just a survival mechanism. It was the only way to navigate a house where my mother's legacy was being erased, one glass table and one organized filing cabinet at a time. I learned to be silent because silence was the only currency that kept Gary stable. I became the survivor who managed the household emotions, while Angela managed the optics. It was a learned helplessness, a conditioning that told me my value was directly tied to how much of their burden I could carry without making a sound. The exploitation began as a trickle before it became a flood. When I was 24, Gary's architectural firm hit a rough patch, an accounting euphemism for chronic mismanagement. He came to me with red-rimmed eyes, talking about the family legacy. I was working 60 hours a week then, building my career with clinical precision. I stepped in. I paid $30,000 in back taxes to keep the Beacon Hill house from foreclosure. I believed I was protecting a home. I did not realize I was just funding Angela's next upgrade. While I lived on black coffee and generic groceries, Angela was redecorating. She replaced my mother's antique oak desk with a glass monstrosity that cost $4,000, paid for indirectly by the money I was pouring into their survival. I watched Gary buy her jewelry for being his rock during the stress, a rock that I was personally keeping from sinking. I had become the silent investor in my own displacement. It was a subscription to a family I no longer recognized. I was footing the bill for a version of love that was purely transactional. In Gary's mind, my independence meant I did not need help. In Angela's mind, it meant I was an untapped resource. I was not a daughter to them anymore. I was a high-yield asset. But every auditor knows that when the numbers do not add up, you do not just keep investing. You cut your losses. You close the file. The digital silence I had established was a declaration of war. They were not prepared to fight fairly. By Tuesday evening, the gaslighting began on social media. I did not need to check my feed to know. My phone buzzed with screenshots from concerned relatives. Angela had posted a filtered photo of an empty chair at our Beacon Hill table with a caption about how some people forget the hands that fed them once they find a little success. It was a calculated move. She was weaponizing victimhood to see if I would fold under the pressure of public opinion. Cruelty in a family is not a sudden explosion. It is a slow-moving fog. It starts with a small boundary being ignored, then another, until the abnormal becomes the standard operating procedure. They had spent years normalizing my exploitation, convincing themselves that my capital was a communal asset and my resistance was a character flaw. This is the trap of domestic normalization, where a daughter's autonomy is reframed as selfishness and financial abuse is disguised as family unity. They were not just taking my money, they were attempting to rewrite my reality so I would feel guilty for keeping what was mine. Gary called at 8 p.m. His voice carried that rehearsed, weary cadence I used to mistake for genuine sorrow. "Madison," he said, omitting any greeting. "Angela is inconsolable. This digital stunt you have pulled is starting to affect my firm's reputation in the neighborhood. People are asking questions. We just need to merge the primary accounts for the optics for the family name. It is a misunderstanding we can fix tonight." He was using guilt like a blunt instrument, trying to shame me back into the role of the reliable provider. I did not interrupt. I did not defend my character. I simply watched the dashboard on my second monitor. I had set a digital trap, and it had just been sprung. The bank security log showed an unauthorized attempt to reset my primary verbal passcode 5 minutes before he called. The IP address originated directly from his architectural office on Charles Street. "Gary," I said, my voice as flat as a balance sheet, "I am not interested in the optics of your mismanagement, and I am certainly not interested in merging my future with your debt. I told you the period of professional courtesy was over. From this point on, I am not the daughter you can manage. I am the auditor you cannot afford." I hung up before he could respond. I did not feel the need to hear his excuses. I went back to my spreadsheet and logged the call, the time, and the failed login attempt. I was building a paper trail that was factual, lethal, and precise. I was no longer a participant in their games. I was the one documenting the rules they were breaking. I did not feel shock when the final piece of the audit fell into place. Shock is for the unprepared. I felt the clinical satisfaction of a balanced equation. I was cross-referencing my father's firm's recent filings when I discovered the kill shot. It was a digital copy of a high-interest business loan for $250,000. The application listed me as the primary guarantor. My signature was at the bottom, a near-perfect replica that would have fooled a casual observer, but to my eyes, it was a glaring error in a ledger. They had not just wanted my savings, they had attempted to leverage my entire professional existence. As a forensic auditor, my license is my most valuable asset. Becoming a guarantor on a fraudulent loan is not just a financial liability, it is a career-ending breach of ethics. If that loan defaulted, I would be dragged into a fraud investigation that could blacklist me from every major firm in the country. Even if I proved my innocence, the stigma alone would ruin my career. They were willing to bankrupt my future, to liquidate their present, but the audit did not stop at the office. I remembered the small cabinet in the study, the one Angela said was organized. I went back to my notes on the planning folder. Tucked behind a series of tax returns was a receipt I had not processed during my first pass. It was a slip from a high-end pawn shop in the Back Bay area. The description was brief. 1 3-strand natural pearl necklace with an antique platinum clasp. My breath did not hitch. My heart did not skip. But inside, the cold resolve turned to ice. Those were my mother's pearls. They were the only thing she had specifically requested. I keep a legacy intended for a future I was still building. Angela had not just used my money. She had pawned my history to cover the interest on their hot money loans. The value listed on the slip was a fraction of their worth, a fire sale price for a piece of my soul. This was no longer a family dispute about overstepping. It was a criminal investigation with a single lead investigator. They had forged my signature on a $250,000 contract and liquidated my inheritance. In the eyes of the law, my father was an accomplice to forgery, and Angela was a thief. I did not reach for the phone to scream. I reached for my scanner. I digitized the loan application. I scanned the pawn receipt. I compiled the digital evidence of the IP address login from the night before. The file was now complete. It was a comprehensive map of their betrayal, indexed and verified. My father and Angela were still operating on the assumption that I was a daughter bound by a sense of duty. They did not realize that in my world, duty is a contract, and they had just committed a material breach. I was not going to fix this mess. I was going to close the account. The Beacon Hill house was illuminated with a warmth that felt entirely manufactured. Angela had spared no expense on the optics of reconciliation. The table was draped in white linen, centered with a floral arrangement that probably cost more than my first car, and the air smelled of roasted rosemary and expensive wine. Gary sat at the head of the table, his tie loosened, performing the role of the weary but welcoming patriarch. Angela was all smiles and soft touches, her voice a practiced melody of maternal concern as she talked about starting a new chapter. It was a beautiful performance, but I was there to conduct an audit, not to watch a play. Halfway through the second course, Angela reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Madison, we have all said things in the heat of the moment, but we have talked to the bank, and they just need your signature on a few administrative updates to the firm's credit line. It is a formality to ensure we can keep this house in the family where it belongs. For Gary. For your mother's memory? I did not pull my hand away. I did not even flinch at the mention of my mother. I simply reached into my bag and pulled out a slim blue envelope. I placed it on the table between the crystal stemware and the silver salt shakers. The weight of it seemed to pull the oxygen right out of the room. I am done with formalities, Angela, I said, my voice clinical and flat. Inside that envelope, you will find 3 things. The first is a digital forensic analysis of the $250,000 business loan application submitted last Tuesday. It identifies the IP address of the office where the forgery occurred and includes a point-by-point comparison of my actual signature versus the one you attempted to replicate. Gary's wine glass hit the table with a sharp clink. The color vanished from his face, leaving him looking gray and brittle. Angela's smile did not just fade, it disintegrated. The second item, I continued ignoring their sudden breathlessness, is a copy of a pawn receipt from a shop on Boylston Street. It is dated 3 weeks ago. It describes a 3-strand natural pearl necklace, my mother's pearls, the ones you liquidated to pay the interest on a hot money loan I never authorized. Madison, please, Gary whispered, his voice cracking. We were desperate. The firm was going under. We were going to get them back. We just needed a little more time. I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw the absolute bankruptcy of his character. Their power had always been an illusion, a fragile shell bought with debt and maintained through the exploitation of my sense of duty. They had spent years confusing their social standing with actual worth. They did not realize that position is just a lease, and their payment was long overdue. When the money stops, people like Gary and Angela do not just become poor, they become invisible. They have no internal architecture to hold them up once the external scaffolding of wealth is stripped away. Their authority was a mirage, a byproduct of a bank balance they had spent the last decade overdrafting. The third item in that envelope is the contact information for my attorney and the lead investigator at the fraud department. I said, standing up. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The paper trail was louder than any scream. You wanted to talk about safeguards for this family. This is my safeguard. If either of you contacts me again, or if my mother's pearls are not back in my possession within 48 hours, the file moves from my desk to the district attorney's. I did not stay for dessert. I did not wait for the begging I could see forming in Gary's eyes or the excuses Angela was trying to manufacture. I walked out of that house, the heels of my shoes clicking with rhythmic finality on the hardwood. Behind me, the silence of Beacon Hill was absolute, the sound of an empty wallet finally meeting an empty soul. I did not have to wait 48 hours for the first entry in their ledger of consequences. The pearls were delivered to my office the next morning by a courier, stripped of the velvet box and the pretense of love. I held them in my palm, feeling the weight of my mother's history, and for the first time, they did not feel like a burden. They felt like a conclusion. The foreclosure on the Beacon Hill house happened faster than Gary's mismanagement could hide. He called me once more when the bank's notice was posted on the front door, his voice a frantic, slurred mess of entitlement and desperation. He talked about family duty and saving our name. I listened until he ran out of air. Then I informed him that my name was no longer a resource he could draft against. I told him I was done paying for the illusion of his stability. I hung up and blocked every number associated with that house. Gary and Angela were left to face the criminal forgery file and the collapse of their external scaffolding on their own terms. I stood in front of my mother's grave on a clear, gray morning in Boston. I was not wearing the borrowed black shoes that pinched my heels anymore. I was wearing a pair of comfortable boots I had bought with the first paycheck I had ever fully owned. I looked at the headstone and felt a strange, quiet peace. I had protected the only legacy that mattered, the one she had intended for me, not the one Gary had attempted to pawn. I closed the digital folder on my tablet labeled Audit Family and marked it resolved. The iron boundaries were finally set. To those of you listening who have ever felt like the invisible child, the sensible one who was expected to disappear so others could shine, I am writing this for you. I know what it feels like to live in a house that does not feel like a home and to be treated like a high-yield asset instead of a human being. You are not a phase, and you are certainly not a future for someone else to spend. Setting a boundary is not an act of war. It is an act of self-preservation. You do not need permission to breathe, and you do not owe your life to people who only notice you when your bank balance is useful to them. Sometimes the best audit you can perform is the one where you realize you are no longer willing to be used. If this story resonated with you, please share it. Let's stand together to protect our boundaries. Do not forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience.